Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we are doing 2-tank chain maintenance, or your short chain maintenance, what you should be doing about every 2 tanks of fuel every 1,000 miles or so. So we should probably touch on one thing first, and that is we're going to be doing chain adjustment, but in a sense, that's not really what we're doing. It's a byproduct of moving your rear wheel. If you move the rear wheel forward, your chain is loose. If you move the rear wheel backward, your chain is tight. Over time and mileage, because those 2 points are fixed, the chain becomes loose as it wears. So incrementally, the rear wheel moves towards the back of the bike, and that reestablishes correct tension in the chain. It'll become a little more clear as we go along. When to do that is going to be enumerated to you in your owner's manual. When to do it will be in there, but how to do it, that's not going to be in there. So that book's not that useful for this exercise. And there are a lot of other factors that influence it too. How dirty the chain gets, the environment that you ride in, how heavy the bike is, how hard you ride. All these factors influence chain adjustment interval. So it really rests with you, and we're going to show you a really easy way to check the tension of your chain all the time, or whenever you want to, and then you'll know when it's time to do it. The place where you are going to find the process is, of course, in your service manual. Climber or Haynes is more than adequate for most jobs, especially maintenance, like what we're doing today. More complex stuff and a more detailed delivery on this exercise can be found in a factory service manual, and the factory service manual is always a good investment. Okay, so let's move on to some tools, essential tools for the operation. Your axle nut is rather large, and it is also very tight. So to break that loose, the perfect tool for that job is a 6-point socket. Next up would be a 12-point socket, but you want it to be a socket if at all possible. A good choice is a box end wrench. What's to be avoided if possible is using an open end wrench or an adjustable wrench. They will do, but it is better 6-point socket, 12-point socket, or a box end wrench. Those sockets are going to go on something that's a little bit different than the ratchets that you're used to, in that it's going to be longer. It's called a breaker bar, and that's its name implies exactly what it's for. It has a longer radius than the ratchet that you're used to, and then you can apply quite a bit more torque to that nut to break it loose. Next up, you're going to have a torque wrench when it's time to go back together, and we'll touch on how to set this up when we get into those processes. It works like a ratchet, but it sets a very specific tightness to any piece of hardware that you put it on. You use this for a lot of different things on your bike, and you'll see the importance of that when it comes time for us to finish up your adjustment in just a little bit. There'll be a mallet of some type involved, or a hammer with a block of wood. After your axle is loosened, we have to unload the bearings and make it so that the wheel will move freely front and back. So there'll be a mallet or a hammer and a block of wood involved in order to do that little job. You're going to be removing in this process a cotter pin, and you can reuse these. This is what your bike left the factory with. It's most likely you're going to find this holding the axle nut in place, but when we're finished, you may want to look into the idea of getting a replaceable, or a reusable rather, axle clip. These tend to get rather boogered up in reuse, and it's difficult to get them out, and it's even more difficult to get them in if they've been used in the past. As a reference for you, unlike most nuts on the bike, an axle nut is referred to as a castle nut because it has these notches in it, and they resemble the battlements on a castle. So your axle has holes drilled in it, and the cotter pin passes through that hole and spreads, and that way the nut cannot come off. Even if it loosens up, it cannot come off. And that's why it's so cool to have a reusable axle clip. Also, we're going to be using, because lubrication is an essential part of the adjustment process, we're going to be using chain lube or some gear oil or some other lubricant on the chain. There's debate that rages around this, but we're going to save that for another time, and when we do a deep dive into your entire final drive section, sprockets, chain together. But having some lubricant at hand when we're finished is going to be an essential thing as well. Okay, that's about it for tools. We're going to head outside to a bike now, and we're going to go over with you the things that you need to do in order to prepare for this operation and the way that the process works. All right, let's go. So, quick chain adjustment starts with the same basic motion that motorcycle riders have been doing forever, and that is, it's just your toe. That's what that initial inspection is. It usually happens while you're getting gas or while you're putting your gear on, and you remind yourself that you needed to adjust your chain when you got back from your last ride. So this is how that quick adjustment works, and you'll be doing it hundreds of times in the coming years. So your toe adjustment, over time, your foot will become calibrated, and you'll learn when your chain is loose and when it's adjusted properly. And when you go like that, you're going to know that your chain is due for adjustment, or at least you'll get an idea that it's time or it's past due. We're going to be headed inside in a minute, and we're going to put the bike up in the air, and we're going to do the rest of the process on a lift because it's much easier to document and communicate to you about everything that you need to do this. But we wanted to take a minute and acknowledge the fact that not everybody has a lift to work on, and most of the time you have to work on the ground. So we're going to give you one thing that you need to do outside or in room that you have to maneuver, because we're literally going to be moving the bike backwards or forwards and checking for a tight spot. The process of adjusting your chain is to the tight spot, and almost every chain has one. The more wear it has, the more likely it is to be there. So you do one of these, that check you did with your toe, but now you're down on the ground and your finger's there, and you get a feel for that and you catalog that. Then you're going to move backwards about 1.5 feet, check it again, move backwards, check it again, and one of those 6 or 7 up-down slack tests, you're going to find one that's tighter than all the others. That's the point that you adjust to. If you have to move the bike before you start, it's important to mark it, so you can put a piece of wire through there, you can put a piece of string through there, or clean that spot and do a Sharpie mark there so that you can come back to it after you get set up where you want to work. But you have to find the tight spot and adjust to it. All right, so we're going to show you how to do that. Okay, so you did your toe tap when you were getting gas and realized that you're overdue or due for chain adjustment. Some manufacturers recommend adjusting your chain on the kickstand like we were outside, because the weight of the bike is on the rear suspension, and that impacts the adjustment or slack that the chain has. Other manufacturers recommend having the back of the bike up in the air. For today, we're going to be doing our work with the back of the bike up in the air and the rear wheel spinning freely. Before we get started, the other part of inspection, the quick easy part was with your toe. The thing that you want to do before you dive in is see if there's anything that the bike can tell us about being out of adjustment or everything being okay. And that's 2 notable things. If you have the ability to rotate the wheel, then you're going to be looking for kinks in the chain. 2 links that are forming an angle that are not in a line. If you have a kink, chances are it will also correspond with, look, I got to go all the way around. It'll correspond with that tight spot that you found. The kink is usually a little downstream or upstream
from that tight spot because the kink is contributing to it. The other thing is alignment. Are we still in alignment from the last time that we did this work? And that is gleaned here. We're going to be going in really close and really tight on this when we go to adjust, but we want to check and see if we're still in alignment. So all of the manufacturers almost will have gradations on the swing arm and a mark on the block or the washer that moves with the wheel fore and aft. When we're talking about adjustment and alignment, remember, we don't talk about left and right anymore because they change places when you move over to the other side of the bike. There's another set of marks just like this over on the other side. We talk about fore and aft. So you're going to count from the front or the back, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you're going to kind of get an idea, am I at 4.5, 4.75, 4.25, and then before you begin work, you move over to the other side, take a look at the marks over there, and make sure that the wheel is still in alignment from the last time that you did this job. And if you find that not to be the case, then it's time to look a little bit harder at what may or may not have caused that. So, no bad discoveries, we can jump in. And we begin here. So we're going to loosen the axle nut, and then we're going to unload the bearings in the wheel, and we do that with a tap. So a fitted wrench or a 6-point socket here, we're going to break that loose, and then we're going to knock over, and then the wheel is free to move, and we'll go from there. Fundamentals as always, it's better to pull the wrench than it is to push the wrench, and the preference is a socket over an adjustable wrench or an end wrench. Get it broken loose. If your axle is not captive, which means it can rotate on its own, you want to check the hex on the other side to make sure that it is not rotating as the nut moves, and we're okay. So we just go a little bit past finger tight. And then very carefully unload the bearings. Now that we're ready to move the wheel fore and aft in order to make the adjustment, it's important to take a moment and see where we are. The manufacturer of your motorcycle is going to have a specification for a particular dimension, and that is expressed as deflection, how much the bottom run of the chain deflects upward and deflects downward. For most manufacturers, that range is somewhere between about 15 and 30 millimeters. And it's information that is probably in your owner's manual. It is definitely in your service manual. So we see how far off we are before we start moving. So we have deflection here of about 18, 22 millimeters. Not too bad, but due for a little bit of an adjustment for this bike. So in order to get the wheel to move in the way that we want, the engineers put in this wonderful device for adjustment. This is called a push type adjuster. And this bolt, as it rotates in what would be called lefty-loosey, looking at it from the back of the bike, it pushes this block that carries the axle rearwards. And there's a corresponding one on the other side. Some motorcycles, particularly vintage machines, will have one that orients differently, and it will be behind the axle, and when you rotate it righty-tighty, it draws the wheel rearward. So what we have to do first, in order to make these adjustments, is break that bolt loose. It is held in place by this nut, called a jam nut. On this particular motorcycle, that's 2 12s. and your eyeball will be able to develop the difference, the ability to see the difference between a 10 and a 12 and a 14. So some motorcycles might be a 10 and a 12. This one is two 12s. So holding the bolt stationary, we rotate the nut lefty-loosey, and then it's free. And you'll notice that the hash mark on this carrier block here is moving towards the next mark that's fixed on the swing arm. So we usually go about a quarter of a turn at a time on each side and then check. And we can see that we're already tighter, and that's about where we want to be. So now we move over to the other side, jump back and forth visually, double checking the position of the blocks mark and the swing arms marks, and make sure that they're the same on both sides, counting either from front to back or back to front, not left to right, and make sure that they're exactly the same. And then we're ready to snug up and check again. Before we lock this down, we're where we want to be, but we want to make sure that we stay there before we tighten up the adjusters. So you use that breaker bar to get that axle loose because it was quite tight. We set that aside, go to a ratchet, and just snug it up so that it won't move. Check to make sure that it has not shifted in that process. You should see no gap between the head of the bolt and the face of the carrier. You check that on both sides, and then you know that the wheel has not moved and your chain adjustment is proper. Bring your jam nut in, and in reverse, the bolt stationary, holding the adjusting bolt stationary, snug up the nut. There is no torque value. You develop feel for this. So after you've done a slight tighten on the axle nut and you know that the wheel can't move anymore, now it's time to check that you're within specification, and we do that in the same way that we did to learn where we were in the beginning of the process, and hold a fixed point and see how much deflection up and down the chain has. And you would want to take it down to the lower part of that manufacturer's specification so that you don't have to do this as often. So if it calls for 15 to 25 millimeters, you would want to adjust to around 15, and then you have a longer adjustment interval, more time to ride. So now it's time for us to tighten up the final torque specification on your axle nut. We're going to be using the torque wrench to do that because it's important that the nut not be too tight or too loose. The torque wrench has graduations on one side in pounds-feet, and on the other side that's in Newton meters. It is imperative that you do not mix those up. Use the scale that your service manual mentions. Set it by rotating the handle in to the correct value for that torque specification. So remember, fundamentals as always, pull the wrench, don't push, and you will hear and feel the torque wrench breaking over or clicking, and that's how you know. So once you've arrived at the correct torque setting, it's time to secure the nut in place. The castle nut has its notches and the axle has its cross-drilled holes in order for you to secure it with the cotter pin. But what works better is a reusable clip such as this, and that way you don't have to carry spares or keep them with you. Through it goes, and it clips in place, and you're good to go. Our final step is lubricate your chain. And that is a debate that rages and will continue to do so. For today, we're going to set that debate aside and touch on a fact that's a lot more important. It doesn't matter whether you're using an expensive chain lube or whether you're using a little bit of gear oil on a rag. The thing that matters is that you're doing this, not what you're using. It's one of the most neglected pieces of maintenance in all of motorcycling, just like having correct tire pressures. So perhaps we'll talk about it in another segment when we get to cleaning and inspection of sprockets and that kind of thing, but that's for another time. For today, all we're really doing is just laying a bit in on the bottom run of the chain on the inside, not on the outside, on the inside. Couple of turns. And then one more. That's it. You're done. Okay, quick side note. We had mentioned push type, pull type chain adjusters. This is an example of a pull type chain adjuster, more common on vintage machines from the 50s, 60s, 70s. It is exactly as described. When the axle nut is loosened, when you tighten the adjuster, it pulls the wheel assembly rearward, and that's what tensions the chain for you. So push type is always forward of the axle, and pull type is always rear of the axle. And as you tighten the adjuster, it pulls the wheel back.
All right, that about takes care of it for today. As always, we'd like to thank you for tuning in. We appreciate the support. Remember, if you're doing these maintenance operations when you're supposed to, it'll exponentially extend the lifespan of your chain and your sprockets and your motorcycle, and it makes it a lot more fun and a lot more safe out on the road. All right, we'll see you next time. Take care.
So you say not doing this is really common, not doing the chain check, not tightening up the chain.
Right.
What happens if you don't do it? Like if everyone's not doing it, what problems do they cause?
The best case scenario for neglecting it is that you have premature replacement interval for the chain, and that's the best case. The worst case scenario for it is that it goes neglected for a long period of time and the chain will break. We have to remember that the chain's under tremendous load, under acceleration and under deceleration, and if it breaks, it can throw itself into your engine and cause a tremendous amount of damage. It can catch you or your passenger's leg as it comes off. It can hit the windshield of the vehicle behind you. The list goes on and on of all of the incredibly awful things that you don't want to happen ever. So it's an easily avoidable bad thing. It just matters. All it matters is it's only a matter of degree.